now we turn to completing the ISLM model of demand that I started in the fiscal policy lecture by looking at how we apply that to monetary policy as well. So in order to understand this, you've got to remember this money market link between interest rates and money supply. So remember that here's the equilibrium between the fixed money supply, fixed by the central bank, and the demand for money, affected by the interest rates. But what happens now if the government or the central bank reduce the money supply, if that goes this way, then the equilibrium interest rate must rise. So we can get LM curve. If the government decreases the money supply, then if we're assuming that there hasn't been a change in national income, then what happens here is that if there's not a change in national income, then this curve doesn't shift. So we must move to this point. So without a change in national income, the interest rate would have to be here. So when we're looking at monetary policy of decreasing the money supply has the effect of moving the LM left or upwards like this. So we draw a more full-size version. Do the opposite, an increase in money supply would move the curve down or to the right, depending on how you like to think of it, causing the interest rates to fall. So the curve moves down by this much and increase. As interest rates fall, then that causes an increase in investment, which means you move along this line here, the IS line. So that means that through that quite simple addition of moving the LM curve, you can analyse fiscal and monetary policy. Both of these things can increase output demand. So expansionary fiscal policy, which means an increase in government spending or a decrease in taxation, or an expansionary monetary policy, which is an increase in the money supply. Either of these things will increase output demands. Similarly, by reversing that, you can decrease output demands, which is contractionary policy. So expansionary policy is using either fiscal or monetary to boost demand. By reversing it, you get contractionary policy, so cutting G, raising taxes, decreasing the money supply, gives you contractionary policy and reduces output demands. But these cases here, that the effect of fiscal and monetary is the same, increase out demand or decrease out demand. But there's a difference in that expansionary fiscal policy raises the interest rates, which risks crowding out investment. Expansionary monetary policy lowers investment rates, which doesn't crowd out investment and could even crowd it in by encouraging it. And in all of these, we're still assuming that there's a closed economy, so the rest of the world doesn't exist or it ignores us. Even more crazily, we're assuming that the price level is the same. Now, thinking about the model again, imagine we've done a big expansionary monetary policy, so you really ramped up the money supply, or you find that income's only risen a little bit. What does that mean about that IS curve, or the investment rate sensitivity? Can we conclude any of these things from that? If we've had a massive increase in income supply, massive increase in money supply, only a small rise in income. Pause it if you like, I'll give you the answer. I'll pause it if you haven't got the patience to watch me draw this on, because it won't be very neat, as you can see. There's the IS along thing. So we start with an initial position like this. And we had a big increase in the money supply, which is, this is the LM curve. So move, massive increase. So that's gone that way. Can't do direct arrows. Yeah. So we'd expect to have from here all the way up to here, this big increase in output from there, or from here. We expect to have this, but in actual fact, we only get some piddly thing to here. What must that mean about the IS curve that would make that happen? Well, if you think about it, it must, the IS curve, instead of being like this, must actually be more like, oh, okay, it could, that. Okay, which means that if you extend this line, it just about work. So when you move from here to here, oops, instead of going from this down to this one, it just went from here down to here. So much less. Yeah. So it's not nearly horizontal, it's nearly vertical. If it was nearly horizontal, you get an incredibly big increase if IS was flat. So that's no good. This is correct, B. This one's not correct because investment being very sensitive to interest rates, that means the small change in the interest rates massively boosts investment. That's the same as this situation where the IS curve is very, very flat. So these two would have the opposite effect. You expect a massive boost to income. It's IS being almost vertical. So it would be like this. And what this actually shows is that when you're using the ISLM model to analyze fiscal or monetary policy, for fiscal policy you move the IS curve, for monetary policy you move the LM curve, but how well it works actually depends on the slope of the other curve that doesn't move. So here it is monetary policy, you move to LM, that's the slope of IS, which shows you that in this case it didn't really have much of an effect, apart from pushing the interest rates down a long way. Okay. Drop the drawing function. Okay. To reduce crowding out, if you did want to do expansionary fiscal policy, but you're worried about crowding out, what could you do at the same time to try and stop that crowding out, undermining the effects of the fiscal policy? So think about that, pause the video, think about it for a second, or carry on thinking while I start laboriously drawing on here. Interesting. So the problem is that here's just expansionary fiscal policy, moving IS. So what you're hoping for is this increase to here. That's how far the whole curve has moved. Oops. So this is what the simple Keynesian multiplier predicts for your change in income to there. That's the initial one. So you predict comes to here. But because of crowding out, the interest rate rises. So you only get to here. And this difference that you don't get is because of crowding out. Because the interest rates have gone up, that means the investment has been cut. So whereas you've managed to boost consumption, you've lost some investment. So that's the crowding out effect. If you wanted to counteract that effect, what you'd need to do is to move the LM curve as well. Move it down slightly. If you increase a money supply like this, then you could end up somewhere like this. Yeah. So that by increasing the money supply, it keeps the interest rate rise down, so you don't lose so much of that expansion in lost private investment. In fact, if you moved it all the way down to here, you could completely counteract that and get the full multiplier effect. So expansionary monetary policy would be the way to do it. Contractionary monetary policy would have the worst, that would be like moving back this way. That would make things even more disastrous. raising the central bank lending rate, that essentially is the same as reducing the money supply. Because if your government bonds, for example, well, when the interest rate goes up, people prefer to hold their wealth, as we showed in the money market, in non-liquid forms. And also, it means that government bonds have got to be reduced. Again, that removes money from the economy. So you have to reduce the price of government bonds, which puts the interest rate up. But it makes the government bonds cheaper, so they tend to sell more of them, and so on. And raising the central bank lending rate means that banks are less likely to lend out money, so they create less money. So this reduces money supply, same as this, doesn't work. This is the one that would work, so the answer is B. So after I've drawn, it's hard to get to carry on. Okay, so summary of the ISLM model is, you can use it to analyse both fiscal and monetary policy. Again, you can do the expansionary method by fiscal or monetary. You can do the opposite to decrease output, and sometimes that is sensible. For example, as we'll see, if you're worried about inflation. But that's where the symmetry ends, because the fiscal policy has got this problem of raising R and possibly crowding out investment. The expansionary monetary policy lowers R. You can combine the two of those together, as I've just shown. A final reminder that this all assumes no foreign trade and no change in the price level, which is nonsense assumptions. Right. So, fiscal and monetary policy both affect demand. They also affect interest rates, but in opposite ways. Right. Next section, we turn to the final model I produced, which is the I show is the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model of the whole economy. We'll turn to that in the next section after a brief pause.